the Cosmos, drifting memory station from Soma Labs. Now, I know there's a lot of hype about this machine. A lot of people are really interested in it. But what it does is very unusual and unique. And if you're hoping to buy a new piece of gear and have it fit within your workflow, that may not be that easy. For me, I love it because I'm into ambient music, and this thing kicks ass in the way it processes signals to create ambient scapes. But if you're used to doing tempo-driven stuff, song-oriented stuff that you can tap your foot to and stuff, this is not going to be your friend. It's not going to work for you. And I just want to tell you that right now because it's amazing, but it's really not for everyone. First of all, you have to remember that this is very niche. It's a boutique instrument. Incredibly well-made, high-end components, incredible physical construction. But it is a very unusual thing, and it is not really going to duplicate any other gear that you have, and nothing else is really going to duplicate what this does. But if you have any experience with any of the Soma Labs stuff, you'll realize most of the stuff is like that. It's kind of groundbreaking, experimental, wacky, creative stuff where they're not copying anybody or anything. They're really going their own way. The first thing you'll read if you look on their website is this phrase: designed to work with meditative states through music. Now that's something really important to keep in mind. A really interesting device, really innovative and unique. But you got to keep in mind that the idea is that this is not a typical thing for typical music flow and ways of writing and recording. This unit is designed for experimentation, exploration, and meditative states using something similar to binaural beats. It's feeding different signals into both your ears so it can induce trance-like states. I know that sounds a little wacky. If you start using one of these things, you'll realize it actually has a capacity for shifting your consciousness or opening you to something, creating psychological opportunities. When I first got this thing, I left it on my desk for a few days. And while I was doing other work on my computer, I would just play a few notes into it and let it do its thing. And I was amazed. It was like, it's a trippy thing. So that's really important to keep in mind. It's a digital device, not really a looper, but it does have some looping capabilities. It uses asynchronous looping. So what's coming into one ear is different than what's going in the other ear. This is what makes it really different from virtually every other product out there. It's not related to beats per minute, and it doesn't use MIDI. So that makes it quite different from other delay-type devices and looper-type devices. It creates loops that get fed back and forth into each other so that it's changing all the time. It's evolving. In some of the settings, things continue to grow in intensity slowly. One of the algorithms is called reverb, but it's really not a reverb at all. It's a series of reflections, and they suggest that it's like a very, very large room that's kilometers large. What it's giving you is something similar to early reflections, and they collect and create kind of a blur and a haze. I've got another friend with a Cosmos, and I was talking to him today, and he didn't even realize that one of the things that makes this unit different is that there are different firmware updates you can use. You load a different version of firmware onto a USB stick, stick it in the flash drive slot. You then hold the record button while you power the machine on, and it loads different firmware. One of the options with the firmware is just like the regular firmware, only instead of this drive knob, it does pitch shifting. There's another version that makes this thing function more like a traditional looper. And by that I mean you push a button to start your loop recording, and then when you push the record button again, it closes the loop. Now, I want to make this clear. In the regular firmware for this unit, when you start recording within one of these algorithms, it determines the record time. It's not a loop that you determine. So, in the rhythmic version, like a traditional looper, you can close the loop and start overdubbing. I think there's 5 different versions of the firmware right now, and maybe there will be more to come. There's the main firmware. There's a quadraphonic version, so you can take 2 Cosmos, upload the same firmware into both of them, the quad firmware, and then when you feed the same signal into both of them, they're kind of operating together. Never heard anybody do that yet, but actually my best friend just got one of these too, so I'm sure we'll be giving that a try. There's a pitch version of the firmware that allows you to use the drive knob to take the pitch an octave down. The only problem I have with that, to me, you should be able to take that down like 4 octaves and take it up 4 octaves, like the Microcosm by Hologram Electronics. It allows you to do dramatic pitch shifting, which is really neat. Then you can take a little sound and all of a sudden it's like, Paul's stretch or something. You're taking something and turning it into something completely else. Firmware version number 4 is the rhythmic one I talked about, the looping one. And then there's version number 5, which I believe is the rhythmic version of the firmware that also has a pitch option. The Cosmos does not send or receive MIDI, so you can't lock it to your clock in your DAW, into a drum machine, a hardware synthesizer. You can't sync it up like that. And that's one of the things that makes it really unusual. And when you start using it, you'll see why. Because what it does is unpredictable stuff. Stuff that is out of time and out of sync and basically causes a freeing of your mind and of your workflow. This unit does delay type stuff. It does some granular manipulation. It does these reflections in this algorithm they call reverb, which, like I say, it's not really reverb. But with one of the firmware updates, it also has digital reverb. Now, that digital reverb is a little limited, but it's interesting that with changing your firmware, all of a sudden it's a reverb. So it'll be really interesting to see what Soma comes up with if they decide to continue to support this piece of gear and expand its capabilities. Now, one of the things I've noticed with it is it has 2 inputs and 2 outputs. However, it's really designed to take a mono signal and to modify that into stereo. I'm talking about the delay lines in different ears. That sort of thing happens a lot with this unit. So instead of processing stereo, and it will pass true stereo right through from the inputs to the outputs, but all the manipulation it tends to do in these different algorithms are taking kind of a mono signal and turning it into a wide stereo field. It's capable of taking a couple of notes and turning it into an incredibly complex series of sonic events in the stereo field. With the feedback knob, if you have it set to 1, these effects that it does will loop continually. If you turn the feedback down, things will fade over time. So you can use it either as a kind of a delay or a looper and have things slowly falling out. Any of you who are familiar with the Frippertronics movement that started decades ago about building upon loops that slowly change over time and nest and become complex things, but really you're just working within a few notes, will love this thing. It's really designed to excel at that sort of manipulation. Compared to other delay lines and loopers, this thing is not repetitive. It never sounds like you're hearing the same thing over and over again in a loop or a trailing echo. That's the beauty of it, is what it does is slowly alter and change the sound. So it evolves over time without you having to do anything. I just want you to be aware of that. It will add nuance and evolution to the simplest of things that you play and have them unfold over time and change and evolve. That's not for everyone. It has 4 different algorithm types and 3 settings within each. One of the things that allows you to do is come up with a setting so you can manipulate the sound, and then whatever is in that recorded buffer, you can change to another algorithm and it will further manipulate the sound. But it doesn't add clicks and pops. It's very clean. Most loopers and processing pedals have a real problem with that. You can't actually change from one series of settings to another without some sort of an interruption of the sound or introducing noise, pops, clicks. So that makes this quite special. It has very few settings and basically everything is here on the front panel. There's no menu diving and there's also no readout, no display, just a few lights. You've got your input gain, your output gain. These 3 knobs work a little bit differently depending on which algorithm you're in. Also, if you upload different firmware, they do different things again. And that's so interesting that when you upload the firmware to take it in the percussive, more traditional looping thing, there's a whole other manual for it because so many things change. So as soon as you change the firmware, you start to see the potential of this thing, not just for you, not just right now, but maybe in 6 months or a year, they'll have another firmware upgrade that will add other features. Now, as you probably know, Soma is one of these companies that does really unusual stuff. It doesn't really have a lot of competition because what they do seems to be geared towards experimentation. Their instruments seem to emit passion, and they call them organismic synthesizers because they're more like an organism. They seem to have a little bit of a life of their own. I've watched so many uploads on YouTube of Soma gear, and the first thing I think is, I bet you couldn't do that again. I mean, their gear takes you in unusual, unprecedented directions. It's very unpredictable on some levels. And if you actually had to go and do the same thing again, I think most people would not be able to do that because it is something that you work with in the moment. It's, to me, there's a real sense of adventure and opportunity. So let's look at some of the other functions. These buttons can be operated with your feet. Most people use these things on a tabletop because there's all these other parameters you want to be able to grab, tweak, modify in real time. But for instance, this erase knob, unlike a traditional erase knob on a looper type machine, this thing does momentary erase. So you can erase just little sections of something. There's a reverse knob, and there are these two filter knobs. Now, here's the high pass filter. If you hold the select button, when you tweak this filter button, you end up with the left LED, which is one filter setting, the right LED, a different setting, and both LEDs, which is a different setting again. Same thing goes for the low pass filter. You have a mix knob that goes from 0% wet to 100% wet, and then you've got a suppressor and a compressor. From the 12 o'clock position, if you turn the knob to the left, you're using a suppressor, which basically allows newer songs to take precedence over older ones in terms of volume. At the 12 o'clock position, there is nothing added to the signal chain. And as you go to the right, there's a compressor. And as you probably know, a compressor generally will even things out. So the louder sounds get a little quieter, the quieter sounds get a little louder. This drive knob adds distortion, but not a distortion that is disturbing to the ear. It actually sounds more like the kind of distortion you get from overloading magnetic tape, so that it's something that is still warm and pleasing to the ear, but it has some edge to it. But it's not a loud, aggressive noise. So what's it really good for? Experimenting, exploring, real-time interactive things that take you to places where the audio you're creating becomes hypnotic. Okay, so that's what I love about it. It's exciting, it's unique, and it will take you amazing places. I just want to make it really clear of what it's not. You can't really use it as a looper because of the things I mentioned before about it not syncing to clock, because it does not respond to or put out CV or gate voltages, and it does not do MIDI implementation. It does not play well with others. It's like a hands-on this and another piece of gear bringing sounds into it in the moment thing. It's not something that you can just automate from your DAW or sync up to a bunch of other gear. So overall, I just love it because if you've seen my YouTube videos, my ambient stuff, I do it all live looping in real time. So the main thing I want to be able to do sometimes is get something going. Maybe it's a bottom end drone or some sort of ethereal thing on the top end, and keep that going so I can add things to it and dance around it. The reason that this thing is amazing for that is when you design those things, those drones or whatever, because of the nature of it, where you have what's happening in the right and the left channel doing slightly different things, the loops that you create, they're always changing and growing. I can create some sort of atmosphere, feed it into the Cosmos, and then the Cosmos, when it has it in the record buffer, will continue to play with it and shift it and modify it. So there's all sorts of little details going on and changing. So even when I go to add things over top that may not get recorded, they may just be real-time sound design stuff, the whole thing feels organic because it's moving, it's shifting, it's changing, it's unpredictable, there's a bit of chaos, and I love that. Honestly, even some of the most amazing gear out there that I've used that is kind of like that, can't touch it. So it's quite simple, it's quite robust, and it's very powerful. I'm not going to talk too much about what it does because there are a couple of Sonic State uploads using this thing that are excellent, and I'm sure most of you people have seen those. But these first three are like a double echo. The next group are like 4 echo taps in stereo. The next algorithm, series of 3, is what they call reverb, which is really a series of multiple reflections that build and build and build and cascade into like this massive and complex timbre. You feed a few notes into it, and they get reflected back and echoed and built. And it's almost like a gong or something that is really tonally complex and changes. The last 3 are granular type manipulations. It takes your recording buffer and takes segments of those and modifies those. But like everything in life, there are a few downsides as well. At least in my opinion, there are a few things that could be changed or that I find a little problematic. It's cool to have low-pass and high-pass filters available right on the panel here. But I've really got a problem with the way they've laid this out. You've got your 3 different settings for low-pass filter. But for me, if you're driving a car and you've got 3 settings of the speed, you've got stop, 50 miles an hour, and 100 miles an hour, don't try parking. To me, the logical thing would have been a potentiometer, just a rotary pot. For 50, 60 years now, we've been grabbing a filter knob and rolling it down and letting the bottom end pass, but just rolling off that top end. It's such a natural thing. It's such a cool sound. To me, that would be a massive addition to this, to be able to roll off the top end in real time and then open it back up, as opposed to having a series of settings that you can engage. Not a big deal, but something that to me would make a difference. I was so surprised when I plugged in the alternate firmware and all of a sudden I had a digital reverb. There may be the odd person that buys this for voice or percussion, and I've seen a lot of people on YouTube trying different instruments into them. Really interesting. But most people are going to use it for creating ambient soundscapes. And for that, I'd say if they worked on this digital reverb in a different firmware version, where all of a sudden you've got a digital reverb that goes like a 20-second decay time, just like a massive cavernous ambient reverb. So you could mix it 100% wet or 5% wet. To me, that would virtually make this unit indispensable for people that create ambient music, because reverb is always a part of it. And to be able to have it and control it and bring it in and bring it out, I mean, obviously, the box has the capability. So maybe that will happen in a firmware update. This is the only piece of gear that I've played with that has that ability to create that hypnotic state where you're just kind of in the middle of something that is magical and fantastic and kind of unpredictable. Anyway, for my uses, I give this thing a 9 out of 10. And there's nothing really that competes with it. My complaints and suggestions aside, I gotta say, I love this thing. I am so thrilled with my purchase, and I just can't wait to continue to experiment with it and upload some stuff to YouTube so you guys can hear what I'm pulling out of my crazy cosmos. The Drifting Memory Station by Soma.